bubbling away this year has been sort of brewing revolts against net zero. There have been some quite massive protests of farmers in the Netherlands, in Ireland. There have been many sort of populist parties that are doing well in the polls that are very openly, explicitly against net zero. And there's even in, sort of mainstream circles with Rishi Sunak, the Conservative government in the UK, and even Emmanuel Macron in France, saying we need to take this a bit more slowly. There's a bit of pause for thought. Ella, do you think the sort of penny is kind of dropping a little bit on this issue where, it's as if they're not quite as don't quite have the wind in their sails as much as they're used to, the elites?
I think that if there's anything good about the cost of living crisis, it's that I think it's made politicians realise that net zero will make people more skint than they already are, and that citizens aren't going to take that and aren't going to vote for them if they are fundamentally going to become more broke as a result of a green policy. I think that is the only thing that, particularly in the UK, the upcoming general election is the only thing that has just slightly tempered Rishi Sunak's position, because he hasn't changed his mind on net zero.
He's at pains to say that.
He's falling over himself to say it, but he's slowed on net zero, says we have to be more considered. I'll take any movement at this point, because previously it has been sort of like a fascistic adherence to a green ideology across political parties. But I think it literally is just a practical realization that if you put in place plans to reduce car usage or reduce how people can heat their homes and all the rest of it, and up energy prices through green levies, that people will not have as much money, and then they will be angry, and then they won't vote for you. I think it's a cynical move among politicians, and I think we have to get better at I think people have to become more vocal at saying this isn't just a sort of money issue.
Yeah.
It's actually it's an issue of democracy, which is that, it's disgusting that you have sort of salivating media attention and coverage of COP28, which is the most drippingly elitist kind of gangbang of awful world leaders. And, people sort of previously disgraced politicians getting up on their high horse and lecturing people about green targets, and, royalty trying to snub prime ministers with ties and all the rest of it.
Sultans trying to sell oil.
Exactly. Yeah. Just this sort of like, you couldn't write a better parody of sort of the state of world politics in COP28, and everybody sort of bows down to it. And the fact that there is none of the sort of day-to-day policy making that will deeply affect people's quality of life is not made by politicians feeling the pressure of their own populaces. It's made on this sort of world stage where people want to look good in press conferences. And I think we've got to get better at sort of outlining the fact that this is not just a financial matter, it's a democratic matter. It's also it's also quite serious about thinking about the future, because so much of sort of net zero and green policy making is about stripping everything back and putting nothing in its place. No plans for nuclear, no plans for any kind of innovative sort of they talk about new green technology, and what they really mean is a few new wind farms, which isn't new and isn't exciting. So I think there's actually a dangerous lack of foresight in all of this, which could mean that you end up in whenever net zero is meant to come in, and there being no gas in the tank. And I think hopefully that sort of realization will start to make itself apparent among politicians.
I mean, Andrew, do you think it feels like this issue just really underlines the distance between the elites and the people? Because it's almost like politics 101 or democracy 101. The public wants to feel better off in 5 years' time than they do now. Yeah. And yet, for some reason, politicians seem to think if they just say the magic words net zero, people will forget about that.
Yeah, it's one of those examples of the elites think they know best, and that they want to rule, and in this kind of technocratic way. I mean, it is interesting that there's been some movement. I mean, Andy Burnham did cancel those plans for a ULEZ style system in Manchester off the back of public outcry. So he's actually sort of responding, as opposed to Sadiq Khan's idea, which is just to keep doubling down. Even though, didn't it cost them a by-election in Uxbridge, the imposition of the ULEZ thing? So people, there's movement within politicians. They're going to have to listen because they want to get elected. And people, as Ella says, people are not going to be happy when they've got less money. And that is and they're going to have to think in terms of longer term as well. I mean, France implemented nuclear technology decades ago and are reaping the benefits now. No current government wants to do that. I suppose it's expensive. I suppose it's unpopular. They don't get any short-term benefit from doing so. But we're going to have to think in long-term terms. I think they've lost the argument about net zero. I think everyone knows it's going to make everyone poorer. It's certainly going to make the poorer, and that's not going to be a good. That's not going to win anyone any votes at any time soon.
I think it was. I can't remember. It was this year that it resurfaced this. Video of Nick Clegg from the 2010s saying, well, if we start building a nuclear power plant, it won't be online for another 10 years, so who cares? And, well, we're still alive.
Ages away.
Yeah. I think people are still going to want electricity in 10 years' time. That's just my prediction.
We've evolved past that for some reason. But there's definitely the political, but it feels like it's probably in the UK feels a little bit more meagre. But if you look at what's been going on in the Netherlands over the course of the past year, obviously you had the farmer citizen movement clean up in their sort of provincial elections, I think I'm right in saying. Didn't really do very much in terms of the recent elections there, but even the defeat of Timmermans, who was kind of vying for the prime ministership, who was very much the kind of EU sort of architect of kind of, or at least the poster boy of EU climate.
Yeah, Frans Timmermans was the vice president of the EU and the leader of the Green Deal, which is their version of net zero.
So the kind of there's clearly an agitation with it, because I think what people are realising is the fact that this net zero agenda, it's sort of class war by other means. It's something which can flatter the egos of bourgeois activists and will barely dent the pockets of people who can afford to pay more for their energy and for their lifestyles, almost as a as a kind of status symbol. But for the people who are struggling to get by, for the people who just need a cheap, reliable car to get the kids to school, for the people who actually are really feeling the pinch at the moment, that's just not going to fly anymore. And I think it's only starting, I think we're only really at the beginnings of this, as it being a new distinct front, particularly in the populist politics of recent times. And I'd just be interested to see who can find a way of prosecuting that argument and pushing it forward, because it's long overdue.
I think you've got to thank Just Stop Oil for a lot of that. Like, insofar as if they weren't
the best thing that ever happened to fossil fuels.
I think the bloke in a wig of environmental protests.
That's it. Every time they glue themselves to a work of art or throw tomato soup on it or interrupt a West End musical, and then they always do that thing of then they lecture the public, and they always sound like something out of a P.G. Wodehouse novel. And, when they are that posh, that plummy, the thing that you're describing is so palpably exposed. The fact that they're ruining people's fun. I mistakenly said it was Just Stop Oil, but it wasn't. There was a group who spray painted a Christmas tree.
Oh, it was the German wing of Extinction Rebellion.
It's called Letzte Generation, Last Generation.
Is that who? Yeah. Right, I mistakenly said Just Stop Oil on my show, but it was.
Yeah,
but
they're the same. They're basically the same colours.
They're probably funded by the same people.
Exactly, but that kind of thing, it just annoys everyone. And if they didn't have names like Hugo Ponsford no, he was one of the Colston Four, wasn't he?
Yeah,
but you get the gist.
Indigo Rumbelow,
exactly.
Amy Rugg, Easy,
Edred Whittingham.
If they didn't
Eben
sound
Lazarus. I've been collecting these over a period of time,
but it's just so clearly exposed. Everyone can see these are posh people against the plebs. That's what it is.
Well, particularly when you don't want to play the sort of you went on a private sort of jet argument, but it is kind of disgusting
so brazen now.
When people like Emma Thompson comes and sort of tries to lecture people, and then the next day is sort of seen somewhere in LA with having gone and done all these sort of trips, and the fact that you have politicians making the case for, and actually sort of very low-level politicians and councillors in Hackney making the case for going around the world to discuss climate politics on planes, but then saying to plebs, no, you absolutely cannot drive down this street because it's killing children. That kind of double standards, I think, is making people sick. But I think also it's a sort of, when we remember when Extinction Rebellion were climbing up on the DLR, and there was the kind of Canning Town Massive, when people were pulling them off the trains, that was a few years ago. I think there has been now a little bit of that there's no sympathy left within the public for Just Stop Oil or those kind of organisations. It's interesting that Extinction Rebellion have really sort of taken a pause and a backseat because they see how ridiculous it is. But I think it's also the case that there is the whole discussion about green politics has lost its nuance, which is that I think people now don't necessarily see it as a sort of it's good to be green, because being green has now become no transport, no going away on holidays, no eating meat. It's become so extreme that in actual fact, I think it's sort of clarified for people what a green future that the Labour Party or anyone else might keep talking about would actually mean, which is a future of austerity.
Yeah.
This isn't about cleaning up sort of London air by putting on a few more buses, which I think few people have had a problem about. This is about reducing people's quality of life in order to meet targets. And that is nothing except a sort of a war on the poor.